Hey, world history. Let's talk about America. So I hope you enjoy my red, white, and blue. It is themed because today we are talking about the American Revolution. So on the eve of the American Revolution, Britain was a formidable foe. We've learned about them. We learned about them all last chapter. Talked about how powerful they are. They defeated the Spanish Armada. They survived a civil war. They really built an empire. And now, let's talk about it. So, why is Britain a global power? So Britain. First of all, location. Location. They're in a position to control trade. They are the farthest, or one of the farthest west of any of the European powers. They are right on the sea. They sent ships across the world's oceans. They have outposts in the West Indies, in North America, and India. They're able to build a global empire. Two, the climate is very favorable to businesses and commerce. There's fewer restrictions on trade. So location, climate. Then in the 1700s, Britain was generally on the winning side of European conflicts. They got Nova Scotia and Newfoundland in the Treaty of Utrecht. In 1763, at the end of the French and Indian War and the 7 Years' War. Remember, the French and Indian War was mostly in America, but the 7 Years' War, pretty much the same thing, but the 7 Years' War was global. Everybody's fighting in it. And that brought enormous wealth to Britain. They also monopolized the slave trade to Spanish America, and they're doing really well. So war victories. Then England's territory is expanding closer to home. England and Wales are uniting. Scotland, they became the United Kingdom. Free trade with Scotland. They're growing. And then Ireland comes under English control there as well and formally becomes Great Britain in 1801. So unity. And then in 1760, King George III begins a 60-year reign. When you have a monarch that's able to rule for that long, you have increased stability. Unlike his father and his grandfather, he was born in England. He spoke English. But he was eager to recover the powers that the crown had lost. He wanted to increase the powers of the monarchy. His mother's advice was George be a king. He wanted to end Whig domination. He wanted to choose his own ministers. He wanted to dissolve the cabinet system. And he wanted to make Parliament follow him. And so he helped his friends get seats in Parliament. And with their help, he began to assert his leadership. But most of his policies wouldn't end very well. So what's happening in the 13 colonies? Well, there's 13 of them, and they're very prosperous. They're part of Britain's growing empire. Colonial cities such as Boston, New York, Philadelphia. They're busy commercial centers. They're linking the West Indies, Africa, and Europe. The shipyards are providing vessels for the trade. And in the 1600s, Parliament passed the Navigation Act to regulate colonial trade and manufacturing. For the most part, though, these things aren't enforced, and so you have a lot of activities such as, smuggling going on. By the mid-1700s, the colonies are home to diverse religious and ethnic groups. Social distinctions are much more blurred than in Europe. You've got wealthy landowners and merchants, and of course they're dominating the government because they always do. But ultimately, in politics, there's a good deal of free discussion. Colonists felt entitled to all the full rights of English citizens, and their colonial assemblies exerted control over a lot of local affairs. So they were sort of developing an increasing sense of self instead of being part of England, but they wanted all the rights. If they're like, well, if you're going to be in charge of us, we want at least the rights of, other people in your empire, right? Makes sense. So, when they don't get it, they're very unhappy. So the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War in North America, drained the British treasury. Wars are expensive. King George III and his advisors thought that the colonists should help pay for the wars because they're the ones that were there in the fighting. To increase the taxes, they passed the Sugar Act, which imposes import taxes, and the Stamp Act, which imposes extra taxes on newspapers and pamphlets. Okay, so let's talk about discontent. Taxes. Sugar Act. Stamp Act. So now you're paying taxes on goods that you get from overseas, and you're paying taxes on any printed materials, newspapers, pamphlets, magazines, any of that. And now they're starting to get angry. No taxation without representation. They're saying, we have no say in Parliament, so you shouldn't be able to tax us because we can't decide what the taxes are going to be. Parliament repeals the Stamp Act, but then passes a declaratory act that basically says, we're in charge of you, deal with it. Okay? Which obviously doesn't end so well. So then the colonists rebel. A series of violent clashes. In 1770, you have the Boston Massacre. There were 5 deaths in the Boston Massacre. And but more importantly than the deaths, although obviously the loss of human life is always serious, was the simple fact that there was fighting. And this is a big deal. It's kind of like a spark. Then in December of 1773, colonists hurled cargo of recently arrived British tea into the harbor to protest the Tea Act, which was a tax on tea. And that's also in Boston. As you can see, Boston was a very violent place back then. And so when Parliament passed harsh laws to punish Massachusetts, other colonists are saying, hey, lay off. And then as tensions increase, the fighting starts to spread and become more organized. Finally, representatives from each colony decided to gather in Philadelphia. They created a Continental Congress led by George Washington. He wasn't necessarily elected in charge of it, but he emerged as one of the natural leaders. John Adams helped as well, and John Adams had defended the British soldiers involved in the Boston Massacre in a trial because he was a lawyer, but he too sees that there needs to be something that changes. And then you have political and social leaders from all of the 13 colonies that are at this Continental Congress. In April of 1775, it explodes into war in Lexington and Concord. So 1775 are the first battles in the war. The Continental Congress then set up. They sent up a Continental Army with George Washington at its head. And in 1776, the Second Continental Congress took a momentous step. They voted to declare independence. So that's when you have the Declaration of Independence, mostly written by Thomas Jefferson. The Declaration of Independence reflected a lot of John Locke's ideas that we learned about on Thursday. Protect the people's rights to life, liberty, and property, saying these are rights you can't take away no matter what. The Declaration also included another one of Locke's ideas. People have the right to revolt if the government is not being fair. This principle of popular sovereignty, government power comes from the people. Also an important point. Jefferson carefully detailed all of the grievances. The Declaration of Independence is basically an itemized list of here's all the stuff that you're doing to us that we don't like. And so they ultimately said that here's the deal. We're declaring independence unless you fix all of these things. And of course, Britain doesn't take too kindly to that, and so the American Revolution continues. At first, the cause looks bleak. The British had a large number of trained soldiers. They have a huge fleet. They have greater resources. There's no reason why they shouldn't win. They just kicked everybody's butts in Europe, so why aren't they going to do the same in America? About 1/3 of the American colonists were loyalists as well, so the Americans aren't even united. That's 1 out of every 3. That's a big percentage. The Americans lacked military resources. They had little money to pay soldiers. They didn't have a strategic plan. Quite frankly, they were not ready for war. They have no money, no plan, and no military resources like, guns and stuff. But the colonists did have some advantages. Okay, so your sides. So your advantages in Britain, hang on. John, can you be a little quieter, please? Thank you. Sorry. So the British disadvantages, the British advantages are, again, their soldiers, their money, and their ships. But the American disadvantages were the land. So they were fighting, first of all, they're fighting on their own soil, and so they're familiar with it. But second of all, that soil includes thick woods that the British soldiers do not know how to get through. I'm going to plug this in before my laptop dies. Okay, there are thick woods, inadequate roads, and the British, who are used to, quite frankly, getting into a straight line and walking down the road, that strategy is not going to work in the American woods. Other advantages were the strong leadership of George Washington. So land, leadership, and then, quite frankly, they had much more belief in the cause. They had a much more belief in the cause, right? The British are fighting for some colonies that they've never been to, and they give us some money. The Americans are quite literally fighting for their homes. And so that's a big deal. But like I said, they have their disadvantages as well. Disadvantages being, military resources, guns, money, and a plan. But France helps. The first turning point is in 1777. The Americans triumph over the British at the Battle of Saratoga, which proves to the French that they're not bumbling idiots, and so the French say, hey, we'll help you out. So they send some money, they send some people who help make plans, they send warships, they send supplies, they send trained soldiers, and then the Netherlands and Spain also start supporting, mostly because they want to see Britain lose something, because Britain's become very arrogant. And hard times, though, continue. In that winter, before some of the French troops arrive, there's cold, hunger at Valley Forge, and it's not pretty. But Washington is patient, and he holds it together. And in 1781, you have a battle at Yorktown. And in that battle, the British were forced to surrender. The French fleet blockades the Chesapeake Bay, which enables Washington to trap them against the bay, because they can't leave by boat because the French are there blocking their naval support. You see, the British had thought that if they were backed up against the Chesapeake Bay, the British ships were going to be able to come rescue them and support them. But France got there first, blockaded the bay, and so when Washington pushed them up against the water, Cornwallis had nowhere to go. And so they were forced to surrender. With that defeat, the British war effort crumbled. So the Battle of Yorktown was one of the last major battles, but it wasn't technically the end. It didn't end until 2 years later when they signed the Treaty of Paris in 1783. And the Treaty of Paris said, fine, you can be your own country. Then they make a new constitution. You've got James Madison, Ben Franklin, these new leaders that come together and figure out, well, we have a country and we don't think we want a king. Although they offered George Washington the title, and he said no. And so they meet and they draft in the early 80s. They create the Articles of Confederation, and that's the first constitution. But it doesn't work. It's too weak. And so they have to redraft it to try and figure out how to not fall apart as a nation. And that's where they end up with the Constitution. They create this idea of the federal republic. They draw upon the ideas of John Locke, of Montesquieu, of Rousseau, all the guys that we just talked about. The federal republic has the power divided between the federal, which is the national government, and the states. So the states have some power, which is different than in a lot of the European absolutist. You see how different this is from all the absolute powers that are happening? You also have checks and balances. And then you have the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights are the first 10 amendments, and they protect freedom of the people. They recognize that the government has to protect certain freedoms, and that's a big deal. And ultimately, the Constitution creates pretty much the most progressive government of its time. The Constitution would get copied and adapted many times, and in 1789, a revolution in France topples the monarchy in the name of liberty and equality, very much like the American one. All right? So, hopefully a lot of that was relatively review for you. Hopefully you've learned a decent amount of American history before. But that's a quick rundown on the American Revolution. You do have a Junipod to do today. But with that said, I hope you enjoy, and I will talk to you guys soon. Okay, bye.